Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome everyone to today's presentation. We know it's been a stressful past few weeks as our world changes daily, sometimes hourly it seems. During this time, ALTA staff has been monitoring the rapidly evolving health crisis and has been working hard for you and the industry on many fronts. We also know this is happening when many of you are handling what may be near historic order volume. While it's the end of the month and everyone is getting creative trying to get deals closed. We appreciate the more than 1,000 ALTA members who registered for today's discussion. Before getting into the conversation, I just need to touch on a few housekeeping items. First, we do need to thank SoftPro for sponsoring today's presentation. All participant lines are muted for today's conversation. If your audio is choppy, you may have a slow or weak connection, and you may want to select the telephone option. If at any time you have a question, please submit them through the questions box. We'll hold some time at the end for Q&A. A copy of today's presentation can be downloaded from the handout section. There you'll also find the latest copy of the CISA guidance on businesses deemed essential, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. As an added benefit, the presentation is being recorded. After we have the file processed, a link to the recording will be emailed to everyone who registered. You'll be able to also access it on ALTA's website. And with that, let me briefly introduce today's speakers. Joining us today, we have Diane Tom, ALTA's Chief Executive Officer, Mary O'Donnell, ALTA's Board President, Elizabeth Blosser, ALTA's Senior Director of Government Affairs, Emily Tryon, ALTA's Director of Policy, and Steve Gottheim, ALTA's Senior Counsel. And we've also, we've launched the videos, so hopefully you can see everyone's faces and identify who's speaking. And with that, Diane, I'll turn it over to you.
Jeremy, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. As Jeremy has mentioned, it's been a really, really crazy couple of weeks. I don't think any of us could have anticipated what was coming. And now that we're here, one of the things we're trying to do is make sure we stay on top of what's happening so we can continue to make sure that all our ALTA members and our industry as a whole is prepared. I'll just give a quick sort of overview. The last couple of weeks, our team, our advocacy team who's with us here today, Steve, Elizabeth, and Emily, literally have been working around the clock on some of these issues. Emily's going to give us an update on the federal piece, specifically on the remote online notification piece. Elizabeth is going to talk to us about a lot of the stuff going on statewide, as well as the recording district closures, which I know has been affecting everybody. Who's essential, who's not essential. Steve is going to talk about that, as well as some of our other hot topics related to GSEs and across the board. And then I'm going to talk about our events and other resources that we have at our organization. But wanted to make sure each and every one of you are well aware of what we're up to. We're here to support what your needs are. As I said, the team's been working around the clock. It's been really exciting to be able to see the work that we've been able to do to support the industry, but we're not going to stop because we anticipate a lot of big challenges in front of us. And now I'd like to take the time to introduce our board president, Mary. Mary O'Donnell is also the CEO of WestCore, and she is based in Orlando, Florida. And Mary, before we get started on our presentation, is going to give us sort of a first-hand overview of what she's seeing and hearing on the ground as someone who's in the business.
Hey, thanks, Diane. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Diane and her entire staff. I've had a little bit of a front seat of watching what they've been up to these last few weeks. And believe me, when they say they've been working round the clock and tirelessly, they absolutely have, and they've made great achievements, and I'm very proud of what they've been doing. They literally have talked to anybody and everybody about you. They've told your story to FHFA, the GSEs, Treasury, HUD, the Senate, Congress, you name it. And I think they've made some great strides, and I'm very proud of them. The board is proud of them. and they are representing you, the membership, incredibly well, and lots of appreciation to all the staff for what they're doing. They've actually also put together an incredible amount of great information that many people, not only in our industry, are utilizing, and that information is updated consistently on the ALTA website. I know Diane will talk about resources a little later, but I encourage you to keep going and keep checking it. Much of the information that they have is of great help in running your day-to-day business. I know I have found it incredibly useful in what we're doing here at Westcor. But from a ground perspective, I will tell you, I've been amazed, not surprised, but amazed at how resourceful this industry is and how resourceful you, the membership, and the agents in the field are. It's a tough time. It is so difficult. And yet everybody is doing the best they can for what is right for the consumer. From closings happening as drive-throughs in parking lots, which are amazing to watch, to closings happening in the backyard of a consumer, sitting on their patio with a screen door between you and the consumer. Just amazing things that I've been watching and seeing from the ground up. Business is still strong. I know it's a challenge. It's a challenge for your customers also. And you are the lifeblood, so keep doing what you're doing. It's incredible. I know it's scary and sometimes a little overwhelming, but I'm very, very proud of what I see happening out there right now. You know, we've battled, last couple of weeks have been amazing, right? Courthouse closing, social distancing, stay in shelter orders, a barrage of news stories. And yet our industry continues to forge ahead and represent the customer better than anybody else. I have never been more proud to be part of this industry than I am right now. And I'm going to leave you with one thought. And frankly, those of you who know me know I'm a big Winston Churchill fan. So I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite sayings that I think is very apropos for where we are today. Because Winston said, if you're going through hell, just keep going. And that's exactly what you guys are doing. So thank you for what you're doing. The board thanks you. Thanks again to the staff. And I am going to turn it over to Emily, who's going to talk about the federal update. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Mary. So to date, Congress has passed and the president has signed into law 3 phases of this response. The first phase was $8.3 billion for healthcare, medicine, and vaccine development. The second phase expanded the family medical leave and paid sick leave. And then the third phase that was just done last week was a $2 trillion package that included direct payments and other small business loans. As we look into the future, we anticipate 2 additional phases. We anticipate a phase 4 and a phase 5. Phase 4 is likely to focus on state and local governments, and we expect that either late April or early May. And phase 5 would be aid to specific industries, and that would follow in either May or June. Congress is currently expected to come back into session here in Washington on April 20th, though that could change. That's what we anticipate at this point. And then I will pass it over to Steve to talk more in depth about some of the specifics in the third phase, that $2 trillion package that was just passed last week. Steve?
Thank you, Emily. And so we'll now kind of dive a little bit deeper into what was passed last week and the president signed on Friday or Saturday, the kind of $2 trillion CARES Act, the Coronavirus Stimulus Act. From the title insurance perspective, there's really 2 big things to focus on in terms of where there might be some help coming directly your way as title professionals, for your employees, and also for your businesses. The first is kind of the top bullet here, that $350 billion in SBA loans for what they call their new payroll protection program. We'll dive a little deeper into that in 1 second. The second part of this is a series of direct payments to individuals, the kind of $1,200 per adult, $500 per child, that will start coming out in the next 2 weeks. And then a couple of other things you see here on the slide as well, with kind of changes to mortgage forbearance and kind of that right to now get a 360-day forbearance, and also this new $425 exchange stabilization fund. So when we talk about the kind of the biggest benefit and the biggest thing that's going to be out there helping you as title professionals is probably going to be this SBA 7A payroll protection program. As I said, there's been $350 billion set aside for loans of up to $10 million for eligible small businesses. And we'll go through the details of what that really means. But the first thing I want to kind of make sure everybody hears and thinks about is, if you are a title company that is struggling or worried about how are you going to keep your staff going and be able to continue to pay your expenses, whether it's payroll expenses, but also rent expenses or mortgage expenses on your business, on your office or locations, seriously consider talking to an SBA lender today. Again, there's only $350 billion of money available in this program. That is a kind of a very large amount of money, but in the grand scheme of things here, it is not going to be enough for every potential business to get loans, throughout this whole period. And so, if you think that there's a chance that you're going to need to access this mechanism, talk to a lender today. You can go onto the Small Business Administration's website and use their lender match tool. That is a tool that lets you kind of locate a bank in your community that is an SBA approved lender. There's also, if you go to the your local Small Business Administration Development Center, there's centers in, I think there are 12 centers across the country, if I remember correctly, that are available to help walk you through some of the requirements here. So let's talk about what's in those SBA loans and kind of what you can get out of it. First is kind of the eligibility question, who's eligible, and it's really going to be businesses, doesn't matter what industry you're in, 500 employees or less, or with a gross revenue below the SBA small business threshold for an industry, which for title insurance is $7 million in gross revenue. So either you're an agent that is 500 employees or less, which is about 90% of title agents across the country fit into that bucket, or you gross $7 million or less in revenue. Either one of those will make you an eligible business. The PPP allows you to get money to cover, as we said, kind of that expanded set of expenses that help you run your business for about, think of it for a 10-week period. So covering payroll, including, not just salaries, but also health insurance costs related to payroll, state and local taxes related to payroll, and then also 401k matches if you're a company that offers 401k matching services, covering rent payments or mortgage interest payments on your on your locations, and also utility payments. So if you need to pay to keep the lights on it and that. Though the amount of money that you'll be able to obtain through an SBA loan is equal to 250% of your average monthly payroll expenses from the past 12 months. So take the amount of salaries you pay a month, the amount of health insurance premiums you pay for your employees averaged out per month, the amount of 401k match that you make per month. Take that number, multiply it by 2.5, and that number is how much you'll be eligible to obtain in a payroll protection loan. Recognizing those loans are really going to start to go live, and processing of those loans goes live this Friday is the expectation. There isn't necessarily for some industries, they need to get money out faster, and so there's also a series of emergency disaster loans and grants available to get money in your pockets faster if you're in a much harder hit area. So that's kind of the center point of the stimulus package. Again, the other parts of it here relate to kind of those direct payments to individuals. And then for our larger members and for larger industries, it's going to be the use of that exchange stabilization fund. So that's $425 billion provided by the Treasury, which will support about $4 trillion worth of lending to larger businesses across the gamut of industries in the commercial paper market. So if you are a business that is using commercial paper lending as a tool for funding your cash flow, that can be another avenue of relief that you're going to get here. But those are kind of the big components for title companies of this stimulus package. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth to talk a little bit more about kind of what's the latest going on with RON, with remote online notarization. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Steve. I want to start out by giving you a little bit of background about how we got here and ended up with federal remote online notarization legislation. So about 3 weeks ago, when we realized that we might be facing a pandemic, we began to hear that there were certain groups and organizations very interested in a federal approach to RON. And we heard that there were legislators who were also interested in listening to them. So at that point, we convened the Digital Closing Executive Committee and talked to them about what we were hearing and what was happening. And at that point in time, they gave us 2 charges. The first was to look into opportunities to make remote online notarization more widely available in this time of social distancing. And the second was to pull together all of these groups that were interested in the topic and sort of form a coalition around a draft that would work for our industry and that would represent the core principles that we've always held, and that being that RON legislation should be safe for consumers, it should be technology neutral, and it should be insurable, something that we can use for the industry. And so that has happened. I do want to take a moment and really thank Michael O'Neill, who is our chief drafter through this effort, and we really appreciate all the time that he spent on that for us. So again, 3 weeks ago, a federal RON law wasn't something that was even being considered, but we're in unusual times and uncharted waters, and so it is now something that we are thinking about. That said, we all know that this is not necessarily a silver bullet. If this law were to pass, it is not going to solve all of the problems that we currently face as an industry. But what we do think it will do is we think that it will help. It will be another vehicle where you, as agents and title professionals, can do what you're doing to support the American public at this time, which is helping people do refinancing, which puts additional money in their pockets at a time that they need it, maybe helping people get some equity out of their homes if this is a time in which they need that extra financial support. So that's something we can all really feel really good about. So I want to get into some of the details about the bill, how it works, what it means for you. So the Secure Notarization Act takes a 2-pronged approach to sort of expanding and adding to RON capabilities. So the first thing that it does is it immediately allows any commissioned notary in the United States to utilize RON with minimum standards. I'm going to talk in a minute about those minimum standards. The second thing it does is it provides certainty for interstate recognition of remote online notarization, and that's especially helpful in states that have not yet contemplated RON in their legislature. So the minimum standards are threefold. The first is that multi-factor authentication is required. So how that's done today primarily is through credential analysis and knowledge-based authentication questions, and that's what really helps us ensure that the signer is who they say they are. The bill also calls for use of multi-factor, of tamper-evident technology. So that means that once a document is signed, there's tamper-evident seal on it so that you know that nothing was modified later. There's also a requirement for an audio-visual recording of the signing ceremony to be kept for a period of several years. You can find a lot of information about the Secure Notarization Act at alta.org/RON, R-O-N. And one of the documents you may want to take a look at there is one called How is My State Impacted? Because at the end of the day, that's what we want to know, right? We want to know, what does this mean for my state? And obviously there's a variety of places that states are at with RON. Some of them have RON laws that have been in place and people are using that technology effectively today. Others have passed laws, but they haven't gone into effect. There's about a dozen legislatures currently considering RON bills. And then there's about a dozen states that haven't yet dealt with this issue. So I would encourage you to take a look at that document at alta.org/RON. Something important to keep in mind is that any state legislation, whether it's been passed previously or will be passed in the future, that has the minimum standards, those 3 standards I spoke about, it will supersede the federal law. So keeping in mind that strong state laws supersede the federal law, that should encourage you all, if you are in the process of passing RON legislation, to continue with those efforts, to figure out what legislation will work best in your state and continue down that road. Something else to be aware of is that anytime legislation is passed as part of an emergency package, there's usually a sunset clause, which means it has an end date. And so potentially if this bill is to be passed, it will have a set period of time in which it's effective. And so again, another reason that states should continue to be working on their own remote online notarization efforts. If you're wondering kind of how does this law work between the state and the federal and the state superseding the federal, you should know the Secure Notarization Act was modeled after e-sign and UITA. So there is a federal law and there are state laws that govern electronic signatures. And so this law would work very similarly to that. Now, of course, for us to be able to utilize this, the law has to pass through Congress, and Emily talked a little bit about that. This is a bipartisan effort. The bill has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. Some of our champions for the bill are Senator Kramer from North Dakota, Senator Warner from Virginia, and then in the House, 2 representatives from Pennsylvania, Rushenthaler and Dean. Some of you might remember Guy Rushenthaler from our last advocacy summit. If you would like to help in this effort, you can do that by visiting alta.org/TAN, T-A-N, and there you can contact your legislators about this issue. So if you go to alta.org/TAN, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a menu. You can click on Take Action, and then there's a bunch of alerts that are going out through TAN. And right now, the first one and the third one are ones that you can respond to ask your legislators to support the Secure Notarization Act. Emily is working really hard to find any vehicle possible to move this legislation, and your contact with legislators really helps. Moving on to the next slide, I wanted to touch really briefly on some of the RON orders that are coming in through the states. These are sometimes executive orders from governors. In other cases, they are guidance provided by secretaries of state. Obviously, we're thinking about RON legislation on the federal level during these times, and so are folks at the state level. And I know land title associations are working closely with governors and secretaries of state and others to work through how can RON be available during this time. You can see on your screen a list of some of the states that have orders or guidance. This list is changing constantly. I think I've gotten 3 more just this morning. So the good news is you can find all of this information at alta.org/RON. So there's a list of all of the states and a link to all of the orders so that you can take a look at those. You'll also see that I added a disclaimer at the top of the list of states and orders. And I think it's important to go through that now. It's 2 parts. The first part says, the powers of entities to issue such orders should be reviewed on a state-by-state basis. And this is important. It's something that I'm hearing from a lot of folks is that, hey, does this entity have the ability to issue an order like this? And if you're part of our SLUR committee, you got a report on all active state legislation today, and it showed that in places like Vermont, the legislature is going back and sort of passing bills that say, yes, we give our Secretary of State authority to do that. So that's an interesting development, something to keep an eye on. The disclaimer goes on to say, prior to relying on any emergency order or guidance, you should contact your underwriter. So I encourage you to be having those conversations with folks. Obviously, these orders vary drastically from state to state, and that makes sense because all of the states were in a different place as it pertained to RON. So in my home state of Washington, the governor just issued an executive order and said that the RON law that had passed previously but hadn't gone into effect yet would be going into effect right away. So he basically modified the effective date. In other states, governors or secretaries of state are just authorizing RON, and there's been no legislation. Not all of the orders are created equally at this point. And as I read some of them, it really looks like they say, hey, you can use FaceTime or Skype to do notarizations. And I know these are really difficult times, and we're all trying to find creative solutions to address the needs of our consumers. But I did want to remind us of a few of the things that were important in terms of anti-fraud protections and consumer protections that we thought about. So keep in mind, if you're using, Skype or FaceTime, there are a few important things that you can't do with those tools that we've said in previous legislation was important. First, there's no confirmation of identity through multi-factor authentication. There's not always a way to record and store the signing ceremony so that you have that as part of your records. You don't always have a shared screen where you're signing things and able to then tamper seal that document to make sure that it's never modified. And then you also need to be thinking about what private personal information you're sharing over those types of services, and whether that private information is protected in compliance with the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. So definitely just some things to keep in mind as we, again, go through these uncharted territories, be having those conversations with your underwriters. But obviously the other party that we need to think about in all of this is the GSEs. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So, for folks to kind of also remember, we're talking about, the use of RON. One set of questions, as Elizabeth said, is you want to look at kind of what does your state law actually allow. Next, you also want to talk with your underwriter and understand kind of some of the risks that they're concerned about with different types of technologies and what they might be willing to insure. But then you also have to look at kind of talking with your lender partners to understand how do they sell their loans on the secondary market and what are the requirements out there for different loan programs about the use of e-sign and electronically signed notes, and also digital closings and RON and the like. One of the things that we know, and this is from one of our questions that has come in on the chat box, and I'll remind folks, if you have a question, please submit it through the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Asked about, the use of e-sign for electronic notes and how is that going to get ramped up. And I'll remind folks that when you look at what's in the requirements, and you see some of them here on the screen for what the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac allow, one of the things is that a lender has to be signed up with the e-note registry that's controlled by MERS. And so we know that that's not a lot of lenders that are on that platform. So you may still have an authority under a state emergency order that says, yes, you can do a you can do a RON over Zoom. But if the lenders that you're doing business with still require a wet ink signed note, you got to make sure you're able to get that done correctly and done in the right manner. And so you have to think about all of those different factors as you're making these choices. You'll also note here one of the things that the GSEs say right now in their guidance is that really that RONs are limited to states that have actual RON laws in place. And so that's another hurdle that you may have to overcome if you're going to do a GSE-backed loan, which about 60% of the country is and loans are GSE-backed, are backed loans by the GSEs or FHA, the HUD program. The other thing I'll note for folks is we do expect some of this GSE guidance to change in this next week. And so one of the things that I know that we've heard from them is that there's going to be a lot more information about what it means to do a RON underneath the MISMO standards and making sure that it's a RON that meets all of those hallmarks that Elizabeth talked about with tamper sealing and with multi-factor authentication. And so, even if a state law says yes, you can do a Zoom notarization, you may not be able to sell that loan on the secondary market, and so you need to think about some of those areas. The other topic in the world of the GSEs that we were really looking at, because it also provides another avenue potentially to give you a way to execute documents with as minimal in-person contact as possible, is the expanded use of limited powers of attorney, so that a title agent or closing escrow officer could, with the borrower's explicit permission, sign documents and execute those documents under a POA on behalf of the agent. Again, something that we do expect to have some changes coming in this week or early next week is around kind of what Fannie and Freddie will allow for the use of POAs. One of the things that's out there right now is that Fannie Mae and the FHA program do allow the use of powers of attorney and allow the closing agent to serve as the attorney, in fact, for refinance only. And so that provides some avenue for people. May not doesn't get the whole square done, but it does get part of it done for agents that have a high refi volume business. We expect that to be loosened up a little bit more. And so that also provides another avenue of options where maybe at least you're only getting the power of attorney signed and notarized if you're in a state that requires the POA to be notarized. And so you're just having that more limited interaction and then doing the rest of it through, through that power of attorney. So those are just some of the things to be thinking about as you're really trying to figure out, what of this suite of options are going to be available to you and to help serve your customers, whether it's a RON, whether it's closing through a power of attorney, or whether it's using this kind of hybrid that you're seeing in the state emergency orders, where it's kind of still a wet signed document, but you're just doing the witnessing aspect through the use of audiovisual technology. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth to talk about kind of what's happening with recording jurisdictions and the latest with the state stay-at-home orders.
Right. So very early on in talking with state land title associations and the Property Records Industry Association, PREA, we discovered that closures of recording offices could be a huge issue for us and for our industry. So what we immediately wanted to do was track that information, find out what was trending there. So we put together a spreadsheet and we put it online and we made it open source and said, everybody add information to this document about what's happening in your recording jurisdiction. And I have to give you guys a huge shout out because you did an amazing job. We got so much information that came in about what was happening around the country. In fact, you did such a great job that we had to sort of streamline our process. So today, if you go to alta.org/coronavirus, you can scroll down to about the middle of the page and you'll see a link to a page that shows a map like the one on your screen and some graphs and other information. There's also an email address there, countystatus@alta.org, where we're still asking you to be providing information about what the status, the operational status of your recording jurisdiction is. So we're really relying on you to share that information. This map and tool has become a huge resource, not just for the industry or our lender partners and others, but you should know that federal agencies and the GSEs are looking at this daily. This is what folks are really using to track what's happening around the country. One thing we've noticed is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to how jurisdictions are handling operations at this point. Some of them are doing work from home and focused on e-recording. Some of them have limited hours. Some of them are open by appointment only, and others are closed completely. So it's good to have this information out there. I serve on the board of directors for PREA, and I will tell you that they have issued guidance last week for county recorders about how to safely and effectively work during these difficult times. So that's information that you can share out to your county recorders, and hopefully that provides some helpful tools and tips for them. All of that said, late Friday, we had some fantastic news. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security came out with a new list of essential services, and it included county recorders as essential services. And I want to read this to you. So essential services now include staff at government offices who perform title, search, notary, and recording services in support of mortgage and real estate services and transactions. So very great news, because a lot of governors and mayors are referring to this list from Homeland Security as their list of essential services. So be sure to be sharing this information about the new list with your governors and mayors that have shelter-in-place orders or stay-at-home orders, so that they have that. Obviously, the list of shelter-in-place states is changing rapidly, and that's kind of a moving target. I want to take a minute to really commend the state land title associations that have been communicating and working so hard on your behalf with governors and mayors to make sure that our industry and those that support us are included in that list of essential services. So Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit more in detail about the essential services.
Yeah, so this is just a pure example of kind of how getting getting those stories and information directly from you all as ALTA members and as folks inside this industry has become really critical to helping us tell the story of this industry to all of the regulators out there. From the first beginning of these stay-at-home orders about 2 weeks ago, we were getting great information in from members across the country about some of the challenges those orders were presenting to you all as business owners, and began to continue to share those stories with the folks at the U.S. Treasury, with Fannie Mae, with Freddie Mac, with their regulator, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and their director, Mark Calabria, with FHA and the folks at the FHA program. You name it, the CFPB, you name it. If they are part of the alphabet soup here in DC, we talked to them and we told them about the difficulties that this industry was facing with county recorders closing. And so when the initial set of guidance came out and had our industry as part of the essential industries that were supposed to stay open, that was a great thing for us, because it showcased how much we'd been able to show that story to the folks in DC, but we knew there was more work that needed to be done. And so we were able to really kind of push that story about kind of the need for county recorders and how, even if you can't record a document, you're not going to be able to close a loan. That story became very powerful. And so that was very helpful in getting the CISA, or the CISA agency, the Cyber Security Information Infrastructure and Security Agency, to put out an update to its guidance last week and expand it to include that very specific reference to county recorders. So again, if you have more of those stories, things that are becoming newer hurdles in your business, please make sure you're contacting all of us at ALTA, because we need to hear them and we want to share those stories with with your lawmakers and with policymakers. So along with thinking about kind of just the world of kind of essential, who can actually is allowed to do business here, the other part of this that we want to talk about for a second is just some of the other stuff that we're hearing from your business partners about about challenges that they're seeing in the marketplace right now. And one of the things that comes up most often in conversations that we have with national lending institutions and their trade associations is just a lot of, not just, I guess, misinformation maybe isn't the best word, but just a lack of understanding of gap coverage, what's actually covered by the gap by covered risk 14 in the ALTA loan policy, a lack of understanding of kind of how the language you see here on the standard ALTA commitment works, but also just an understanding of how are underwriters and the industry working to provide gap coverage without exceptions. And so I would encourage you, if you are, as you continue to work with your lending customers, have that conversation. Help them understand what's in the affidavits you're asking your buyers and sellers to sign. Talk to them about why you're asking them to waive their closing instructions and what that actually means, because there is just a wide variety of the type of exceptions that lenders are seeing. Some of them are very broad and say something along the lines of, the company reserves the right to basically change any term and condition of the policy at its choosing for all time. If there's something in relation to COVID-19 that comes up, probably going to have a lot more pushback from a lender if you have an exception like that in your policy versus something that is much more narrowly focused to the types of gap issues that you have here. So I encourage you to have that conversation, because one of the requirements that we know from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is they know that there's gap coverage in the loan policy, and all they care about is making sure they're getting a loan policy with gap coverage without exception. And so you need to help your lender make sure they're going to be able to get the policy that lets them sell a product to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, by making sure you're kind of talking through some of these issues with them as you go forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Diane to talk more about ALTA events.
Sorry about that. Well, as you guys can see, our advocacy team has been working literally tirelessly the last couple of weeks. I can't say enough about how proud I am with the success they've had in being advocates on behalf of our industry. But again, I'll just reinforce, we're not going to stop there. We know the coming months they'll have more challenges, and we'll be ready. And we wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of what's going on with our upcoming events. Our digital closing and e-mortgage bootcamp, along with our HOP leadership training, is being postponed. We're looking at dates in December. But in the meantime, I know Elizabeth's working closely with the MBA to do some digital education around this. So stay tuned. As Mary mentioned earlier, check out alta.org. We'll be updating information regularly. The ALTA Advocacy Summit has also been postponed. As you know, that was scheduled for May 11th through 13th. We're still going to try and do something. Director Calabria from the FHFA has agreed to be a speaker. So we're looking to do something virtually in May around that still, so stay tuned for that. But we will also be postponing that, so probably later in the fall. The commercial network, which is scheduled for June 1 through 3, is going to be rescheduled for next year as of now. In the meantime, I know Elizabeth and Deirdre have been working on some education around that. And I say stay tuned for that too, right, Elizabeth? In the next couple of weeks, we could be seeing something around that. If folks have questions, obviously, feel free to send them our way. I think Jeremy has put some information on the next slide around that. All of our resources we have. So every day we've been putting out an update around, we try to put it out midday with all the latest information on county courthouses that are closing, new guidance from Homeland Security that's sent out. Folks like Mary and our board are sending us updated information. So if you have stuff that you want to make sure that the industry knows, please send it to Jeremy at communications@alta.org. We'll make sure we get that out in our daily update. But in addition to that, we're also looking for stories. Mary mentioned about some of the creative ways our industry is continuing to be able to serve the consumer. We would love to hear some of the things that you're doing. And a lot of the, we know tons of folks are doing all kinds of things to support the coronavirus first line workers, making masks and bringing meals to hospitals. So keep us posted on the different efforts. We want to be able to share that with each other. It lifts us all up, but it also gives us ideas on ways we can better serve our communities during these really challenging times. And with that, I will say we'll open it up for questions.
All right, thanks, Diane. Yeah, as we mentioned, if you have any questions, submit them in the questions box, and we'll pitch them to all the speakers. A few of them that have came in. It's not quite TRID implementation volume, but lots of questions are coming in. We'll try and get to them in buckets as we address them in the PowerPoint. SBA, getting lots of questions about the SBA loans. Steve, if you're still on, or if hopefully Gabe doesn't have your attention, or if he does, that's good for you. Can you apply for SBA loans now, even if you don't need the money immediately?
So the short answer is not only yes, can you, but yes, you should if you think that there's a chance that you might need that money in the next few months. The only requirement to get an SBA loan is that you meet the eligibility requirements, which means you're a business of a specific size, 500 employees or less, or 7 million in revenue or less as for title agents. So that's the only requirement. It doesn't require you to show financial harm. It doesn't require you to say that you are at imminent risk of laying somebody off. If you've already laid people off, you're able to get a loan and be able to actually potentially bring them back in and still be able to get some of the loan forgiveness provisions that are in this program. So I would encourage folks that if you think that there's a chance you're going to need these funds sooner rather than later, apply now, start the process. If you don't go through it, these are no fee loans. You don't have to pay anything for going through this underwriting. So even if you decide not to execute and close the loan, at least you have started that process, got into the queue, and have a chance at some of that money if you wind up needing it, as opposed to waiting and maybe being on the outside once they've already spent all $350 billion. The other thing that I know I forgot to mention, I know there's a question in here about it, is about loan forgiveness. And so, as we said, the program is designed to cover again basically 250%. Your maximum amount you can borrow is 250% of your average monthly payroll cost. You can borrow less if you want, but that's the maximum amount that you can borrow. For whatever amount you borrow, there is a mechanism that allows that loan and that amount to be forgiven for an amount equal to essentially 8 weeks of your payroll. So essentially 2 months worth of payroll can be forgiven under this program. So it is a with some exceptions. So I will say, if you wind up taking this money and also still laying off some employees, you do have some of that forgiveness deducted away from you. But there are those options available to you, so that this is able to get out there, help you keep people employed, keep your operation going, and also have some of that forgiveness as well. So it's it's worth you taking a look at some of those terms and talking with a SBA lender and using that lender match tool to find one in your community.
Steve, you mentioned laying off employees. What if a company has already laid off employees?
Again, so you are able to still apply for these loans. I would tell you, you can also use that money to bring people back on if you had laid them off. Part of what they're going to look at is, and what your maximum amount is based off of, is your payroll from about, at the very least, from February. So if you've laid off people from kind of between February and March, that may create some issues where maybe you're not going to get as much forgiveness as you wanted, or as we're originally entitled to. But it doesn't mean that you won't be eligible for the money.
Okay, we are getting lots of questions on SBA. We'll try to get a few more on SBA and then get to some of the other topics that we discussed. Steve, question was asked if loans could be turned into grants if all terms are met. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so that's the forgiveness that we're talking about. So there are two different grant program parts of this. One is, if you really need money right now, there are some options for these emergency disaster loans, the EIDLs. Those are $10,000 grants that get money right in your pocket quickly as you start to apply for a loan. But if you don't go through that route, again, if you get an SBA 7, if you get a loan under the Paycheck Protection Program, about up to 8 weeks, an amount equal to 8 weeks of your payroll costs can be forgiven as part of that program, and the rest of that loan then it converts to a 10-year loan at less than 4% interest. So you can get a large amount of it forgiven and essentially turned into a grant, as opposed to having to pay back the loan in complete.
Okay. How about a little bit more information on some of our smaller sized operations, some that might be sole operations with no payroll except for the owner? Can they still qualify for an SBA loan?
They can. So for the first time ever, SBA loans are now eligible for sole proprietors or independent contractors. So both, if you are just a solo practitioner out there, you can get an SBA loan to cover what would have been your salary for this period of time, and it is also still eligible for that forgiveness portion as well. But if you're also a small employer where you're a sole proprietor, but you have maybe a couple of employees, you can include what would have been your salary into that calculation for the maximum amount of loan that you're able to take on. Your vendors also are potentially going to be eligible as well, especially if they're independent contractors. So encourage your vendors, if you've got independent title search or independent closers that you work with, to look into getting these loans as well if you really rely on them to be able to provide service to your customers.
Okay. Again, just a reminder, if we don't get to your question, or if you're looking for a little bit further detail, just shoot us an email at communications@alta.org, and we'll do what we can to answer your question. Let's move on to another topic that's getting lots of questions. Our buddy Ron. Elizabeth, maybe you can help us out. With regard to Ron, have we had any discussions regarding recorders accepting Ron documents, or Ron is not being accepted currently?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm glad somebody brought it up. There are a couple of things we're doing to help educate recorders about the need to accept these electronically executed documents. One method is working through PREA, again, the Property Records Industry Association. They've put out some guidance on this. We're discussing maybe putting out further guidance on making sure that people know that they may start seeing more electronically executed documents. The other thing that's been interesting is that, we saw this past week a Supreme Court come out and give guidance to recorders that they needed to accept electronically executed and signed documents for the jurisdictions statewide. So certainly some interesting things happening in this space. One of the themes that we've talked about over and over again is communication, talking to your lenders, talking to your underwriters, and I would add county recorders to that list as well, and having that communication with them, letting them know sort of what to anticipate and what's coming down the pike. And if you're working with your state land title association, these are also great conversations to be having with notaries through your Secretary of State's office, and for them to be providing some guidance out to recorders as well. So certainly something we're thinking about and continuing to work on, and I would encourage you to be having those conversations as well.
Here's a good question, is being able to connect people on the call with vendors who can help them. Is there a list of Fannie or Freddie approved RON technology vendors? Elizabeth, you might not have the URL off the top of your head, but there is a list of approved vendors, and you also can go to the ALTA's website and look under the marketplace to see vendors that provide RON capabilities.
Yes. So both the GSEs have a list of approved digital closing and e-mortgage vendors. We're actually working to get that up on the alta.org/RON page. I have provided that information out to all the state LTAs as well, so that they have that. Additionally, MISMO provided a list of vendors that is available, and of course we always encourage people to go to the ALTA marketplace and search for vendors there.
Okay. Question about the Secure Act proposed bill. The question is if there's a paper out option for RON in counties that do not have e-recording?
So that was a topic we discussed a lot, because obviously papering out has been a big issue on the state level for jurisdictions that don't e-record, and being able to take that electronic document, convert it back to paper, and go ahead and record it. And so we wanted to be able to include that with the Secure Notarization Act. Unfortunately, we weren't really able to figure out a way that we thought that there would be sort of legal grounds and certainty for including that sort of required provision as part of a federal law. So certainly lots of thought given to it, but not something that we were able to incorporate into the language at this point. Obviously, a lot of states have included papering out as part of their state law provisions, and some states also had papering out provisions on the books, but unfortunately not something we could bake into the federal RON legislation.
All right, just cleaning up the questions queue here a little bit. Any of y'all hearing anything about closing timelines possibly being extended, as we're dealing with a lot of the state orders of approving RON?
It's certainly something for you all to start thinking about and having those conversations with your lenders. Most of your closing timelines are either going to be set by your sales contract if it's a purchase agreement, or it's going to be in those closing instructions and in the refinance agreement with the borrower and the lender. And so you need to have that conversation if you are concerned about being able to meet the needs of that customer in whatever timeline are out there. I will say, we are hearing stories from a lot of national lenders that there are processing challenges and loans are taking longer to complete just to get through basic underwriting, and then also that there are going to be some issues as this continues with rate locks and the like. And so having that conversation up front, understanding where that fallout might be, and understanding where there's going to be allowances for closing times to get extended is going to be very crucial for you to manage your pipeline over this period of time.
And this is more of a comment, not a question along that vein, but Ronnie says there, in regards to delays in closings, they're finding obtaining payoffs and HOA demands are taking longer as well. So maybe seeing that in your market as well.
So one of the questions I see here, Jeremy, is on a couple questions on kind of the use of powers of attorney, and so I'll kind of talk about them for a second. One of the things to take a look at, and you'll notice this if you look at the Fannie and Freddie guidelines currently on powers of attorney, is that they're limited in who can serve as a power of attorney right now, especially in purchase transactions. So Freddie for all transactions and Fannie for purchases say that if you can't serve as a power of attorney and execute under a power of attorney if you are a party to the transaction, which means an employee of the lender, an employee of the real estate agent, or an employee of the title company. Now for refinances, Fannie has said the only caveat is you can't be an employee of the lender. But we are working with Fannie and Freddie right now to kind of relax some of those limitations for more transactions to give you that option to use a power of attorney as a method of executing documents on behalf of your customer, because as we know, there are some challenges with getting ready to go for a run if you're not, if you haven't been kind of working with those vendors already. And so this is just one more tool in your shed to try to get loans closed during this time.
All right, thanks, Steve. Again, if we don't get to your question, email us at communications@alta.org. We will got a lot more coming in. We'll take a few more questions, and then I'm sure everyone has lots of orders to try and tend to. Steve, maybe, additional thoughts on essential businesses. Question asked if appraisals are considered essential.
I will tell you that I have not looked in to see if appraisals are in the list of essential businesses. I don't believe they are, but we do know that Fannie and Freddie have both relaxed their guidelines related to appraisals over the last few weeks to allow for more of drive-by appraisal, so that the appraiser doesn't have to go into the house and to have some of those issues coming up. So you really need to talk with your lenders about kind of making sure that they're able to get the appraisals that they need as you're going down working on a transaction.
Okay. And Mary, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're in the industry, and question is, are you hearing about buyers and sellers willingness to still come into the title agency for closings, in states with shelter in place? What are you hearing from some of your agents across the country?
It really depends very much on the type of transaction or where in the country you are. Obviously varies very much depending on the intensity of what's happening in your particular market. Certainly, I know we hear a lot from the Northeast, where you have very often a different closing process with the attorneys being involved, not from the title side, but actually representing participants where buyers and sellers are not coming to the attorney's office. The attorney is not going to their office. You see a wide variety of things happening, some trying to use electronic means, some literally driving to the home and standing outside and looking through the windows and doing closings that way. So it's a little all over the place right now. I think that's where certainly on refinances, the limited power of attorney can be really helpful, because at least you're only looking at one document that you've got to get to that consumer to get signed. But certainly there's a concern on the buyer and seller side about physically going to a closing. So the work that ALTA is doing, what we're trying to do with remote, I think is going to be more and more important as we go through these next 30 days, especially.
Yeah, I've seen some creative ways of, I don't know if it's selfie sticks. Title companies use the selfie sticks and out the window into the car, and that they can sign the documents, and then they're one-time use pens. But definitely companies out there being creative to keep the orders, getting them closed.
Yeah.
All right. Again, one more time, we're almost at the top of the hour. If we didn't get your question, email us at communications@alta.org. If you missed parts of today's webinar, you think others in your office would benefit from listening. Again, we are recording the presentation. Everyone who registered will get a link to the recording, and it will also be available on ALTA's website later today. With that, we'll wrap up. We do need to thank SoftPro once again for sponsoring today's presentation. And again, as a reminder, if you're looking for resources on all things COVID, please go to alta.org/coronavirus. And with that, thank you everyone for taking some time today for getting this important update. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.